Welcome to Crash Landing. My name's Steve, and every episode I'm going to be guiding an intrepid explorer as they crash land on an alien planet. They have 1 hour to choose the 5 books they couldn't live without on their brave new world.
Warning, ship crash landing. You have 60 minutes to enter the archives and recover significant cultural artifacts. Authorization required. Identify yourself.
Well, thanks for having me on, Steve. I'm Tim Pratt. I've been publishing novels since 2005. I published 25 of them or something like that. Who can keep count, really? Most recently, I have a space opera trilogy from Angry Robot, a fine British publisher. Mm-hmm. And the first book, The Wrong Stars, came out a couple years ago. Last year, The Dreaming Stars, the sequel, came out. And this fall, in October, the final volume, The Forbidden Stars, will come out. I also publish a whole lot of short stories, and I won a Hugo Award quite a long time ago, but it was still nice to win one back in 2007 for short story. And I also have a new collection coming out this fall called Miracles and Marvels, which has some of my best stories from the past 7 or 8 years.
Excellent. Keeping yourself busy then.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on the podcast. And the good news is you get to talk about some books. The bad news is I'm going to have to crash land you on an alien planet. You only get to take 5 books with you. But we'll get to talk about the planet later on and what you've chosen and why. But to begin with, we'll talk about the 5 books. So tell me what your first choice is and why you've picked it.
So if I'm going to be marooned, I think I would take Joe Abercrombie's Best Served Cold, which is my favorite of the First Law novels. I like all of them. I like the original trilogy and all his other one-off books, too. I like my fantasy nice and grim and with lots of lopped-off heads. But Best Served Cold I reread every year anyway. I love revenge novels. I love the escalating revenge structure as a novel structure. Mm-hmm. I think someday I will write my own escalating revenge novel. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But I love that just as a way to systematize, and you get to explore all these things about the human character when you do a story like that. And if I'm going to be marooned all alone with no other humans, I think a book like that makes me hate all humanity and think that all people are awful, vile bastards who are best avoided, that could be good for my psychological state of mind. So that's why I would take that one.
It's interesting you picked that one, though, because I've read all of his First Law books as well. Of course, he's now going to be bringing out a new one later this year. I think I like the arc from the first trilogy most, I think, and the characters in there that pop up every now and then later on.
No, I do. I love that one, and I reread that one, too. And Logan Ninefingers, obviously, is one of my favorite characters in all of fantasy. And this is a book that he's not in. But still, I'm just a sucker for a revenge tale. It's just such a beautiful form to tell a story in, and all the different approaches to the revenge and, the toll that it takes on people. I just think it's fascinating stuff. Also, I'm deeply, deeply vengeful and vindictive myself. So,
so you're plotting someone's demise with this book as a guide.
Very long term. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just taking ideas and inspiration from it. I see.
That's right.
Oh, good. That's good. I mean, I know that Christopher Lee used to read Lord of the Rings every year for sort of like 40 years until he died. But I've not heard of anybody reading Joe Abercrombie every year. So.
Yeah, I think it's been every year, Best Served Cold. Maybe I've skipped a year here or there, but yeah, if you're going to go on a long plane ride or something, then whatever it is, an 800-page book is a good companion. So.
Oh yeah. I'm currently reading Chris Wooding's The Ember Blade, and that's like an 800-page beast. So that's a great book to have on a plane.
It can be nice to just immerse yourself fully and know you're going to be there for a while.
Oh, yeah.
I say this as someone, my own books are, 300 pages long at the outside. So I have never committed such a work, but I do appreciate them.
I think what I liked about this book as well is that because we'd already had a trilogy but before then, he'd set up a lot of stuff to do with the world. So he didn't really need to get into that too much. I mean, somebody who came and read Best Served Cold straight away, they could get the whole story and enjoy it, but they definitely miss out on a lot of other things. So,
oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, and the evolution of Carl Shivers, especially. I mean, that character, the way that he is in the First Law trilogy, and then you see what he becomes, is just heartbreaking. No, I used to. I like Stephen King's novels a lot too, although I'm not taking any of them on the spaceship.
Yeah.
But he tends to sort of connect all of his novels together eventually, right? Like he'll refer to characters in a much later book from earlier ones, and he would occasionally do this awful thing where he'd mention some character who'd been the protagonist of a book, and then say, "Oh well, they died of they were an alcoholic and they died of cirrhosis of the liver later," and it's just so brutal and offhand, and it's sort of like that with Shivers, right? You end the First Law trilogy thinking it's actually one of the only kind of hopeful notes in that trilogy, and then you get the Best Served Cold and see what became of him.
And it's not good. No spoilers, but it's really not good for him.
Yeah, no, it's he has a journey, which I guess even continues beyond that too. But yeah, he's a good character.
Oh yeah, I'm very curious to see what he does with the new trilogy, because even though time has passed, there are references to certain characters or progeny of certain characters coming up. So that's going to be really interesting.
I'm excited for it too. I liked his Half a King stuff too,
YA
that trilogy.
Books. Yeah,
they read a little bit to me like a more teen-friendly version of Best Served Cold, honestly, because it's the same kind of thing. A great outrage has been committed against me, and I'm at my lowest point, and I have to come back from it and gather together sort of a motley crew of people to help me do it. At least the first book. I mean, it develops on after that, but which I liked because, again, like I said, I love that as a structure. A burning mission is a good thing to give a character.
Oh yeah. But yes, I'm looking forward to the new one to see what he does with that, and he's busy. A Little Hatred, I think the first book is called.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. One of the nice things about I work for Locus magazine, trade magazine for science fiction publishing, so I tend to get my hands on books early, which is which is a nice treat.
Oh right, okay, so we know what to come to. Okay,
that's right. I thought I was going to get mugged once. I got a copy of Dance with Dragons about 3 weeks before it came out, the George Martin. And I read it in my house. I thought about taking it on the train, but I was actually afraid I would be mugged if I took it on the train.
I think that's very likely, yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Because if you get your hands on Winds of Winter before anybody else, that's it.
Absolutely.
You just have to have a false cover on the book.
You would, yes.
It wouldn't be... It's like they do with scripts for various TV shows and films. They have on like pink paper, so you can't photocopy it and this kind of stuff. That's
right. Or you call it Torchwood, right? You give it a code name.
That's it.
That's the way you have to do it. Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about your second book. And I'm not familiar with this one.
KJ Parker, Devices and Desires. So KJ Parker, of course, is Tom Holt's alter ego, who does, honestly, not terribly un-Abercrombie-like fantasy without a lot of magic stuff, and has done many books that I really love. I like KJ Parker novels and short stories. Some of the stories are amazing. But Devices and Desires is the first one in the Engineer trilogy, which is my favorite, and which is also sort of an escalating revenge series, and also full of terrible people you wouldn't want to spend any time with. So I suppose psychologically, similar reasons. But the Engineer trilogy is about someone from a relatively advanced culture, an engineer, who, for various reasons, has to flee, right? They're under threat of death, and so they leave. And they take their expertise out into the barbaric other nations, right? Mm-hmm. And you can make a good living when you know things technologically that nobody else knows. And this is technology on the order of siege engines, right, rather than on the order of spaceships or even steam power. But knows how to build things. But the engineer of the title has a longer-term plan, which nobody knows about. And it is somewhat vindictive and somewhat redemptive. And it, over the course of the trilogy doesn't quite turn out the way that he expects it will. But it's just a beautiful, intricate puzzle box of a series. In one where the structure absolutely mirrors the theme, too, because it's about, these intricate creations that don't quite work the way you expect them to. And any technology has consequences that you can't predict, right? And his plan, his great construction that he's making using whole city-states, and politicians and the apparatuses of civilization, he's building a machine to achieve a particular end that doesn't quite work out the way he thinks it will. So I love the whole trilogy, and I considered, cheating and saying an omnibus of all three books. But I'll just take the first one, and then as I'm marooned, I can try to remember what happens in books 2 and 3. It'll frustrate me, and it'll keep my mind occupied as I try to remember exactly how it works out, because it is a very intricate series.
So when he has the technology and takes it out to other people, does it have a knock-on effect? Like he gives, I don't know, some sort of siege engine to someone in order to get food or to survive, and meanwhile that then starts to ramp up or destroy another civilization that he didn't anticipate.
Very similar, yeah. Like once you let that genie out of the bottle,
Yeah.
right? Once you've taught somebody how to make a thing, and the whole point of being an engineer is that you create tolerances and specifications and things that can be mass produced. So, I mean, basically, he's from a culture that has a monopoly on these technologies, and it's a very restrictive and controlled culture because they don't want to let any of that technology into the hands of anyone else. This way, they have overwhelming force, right? But there is a bit where he meets someone who's from another society who's just a native genius, right? And once that native genius is exposed to some of these things, because our engineer actually is not particularly a genius inventor. He's just extremely well trained and very good at his job.
Yeah.
And he meets someone else who then says, well, if we take these principles, we can do things like, and not to be a horrible spoiler for the whole thing, but he starts to think, well, could we build artillery? What if we had gunpowder, right? And starts to take it beyond. And, this is not necessarily in keeping with the intricate plan, right? You can't control whole peoples, right? You can't control whole societies. You can sort of nudge them, but I don't know. It's a neat series. A lot of hubris.
Yeah, it sounds really like that. The fact that he's busy plotting his own revenge and trying to get back to the people who've wronged him, and meanwhile he's impacting a number of other people and societies. There's no idea, or maybe he doesn't care enough about it. Right.
It's offcuts, right? It's all just extraneous parts of the process, right? All he cares about is his ultimate end, and it's a weird series.
I've never heard of an engineer in a sort of a fantasy book as a main character before either. This is the first for me.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because once you can build scorpions and ballista and things like that, it does change things a lot.
Yeah,
and it's funny. I was watching Game of Thrones, and they've had some large battle scenes this season.
Oh yes.
Here in one of the fan fiction seasons, and I'm watching it thinking I know nothing about medieval warfare except what I've learned from Tom Holt's K.J. Parker novels, and based on that alone, I can see all the problems. Right, I know exactly what they should have been doing instead. Right, and you have to give Tom Holt his proper credit because he researches, especially for the K.J. Parker stuff. He has a series about someone who makes swords, and he went and made a sword, right? Learned how to make bows and arrows, how to make armor, right? The duels and the battles in his books tend to be based on historical duels. He goes and says, well, when people really were settling their problems by sword fighting. He has a series called the Fencer Trilogy where lawyers basically sword fight to win trials.
Oh, okay.
And he went in, and they're all very weird and interesting because he often bases them on what actual duels were like. So he did all the primary research, and I'll just read his books as secondary research and feel that I have a solid grounding.
Well, you can only do so much research. I mean, I did
exactly
research for my fantasy novels on, making weapons and this kind of thing. And I've done archery, so I thought, okay, I'm going to get that right up to a point.
Yeah.
And then last year I went and made a sword at a forge for a birthday present.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. And then I kind of looked at the blacksmiths, looked at what I'd done in a day, what I'd managed to do, and how I'd cheated various things. And I went to the end and said, "I'm sorry." I just apologised for the stuff in my books. I said, "I'm so sorry," and they said, "It's okay. We know." So going forward, I will do better. But I got some things wrong. I just didn't realise, because until you go and do it yourself,
Oh, absolutely. And you get emails from the experts, right? I've gotten emails from gun people and sword people, and it's not as if I'm completely cavalier about it, but there's things that you just miss.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But you do your best. You can't be an expert on everything. And if it was all research and completely, you'd spend years and years doing the research before you wrote any of the actual book. Yeah,
it would be all world building and no world. Yeah. Well, and I console myself. If I ever watch a TV show or a movie that is set in publishing, for example, which, after 18 years at Lucas, I know a fair bit about publishing, I feel better because they get everything wrong. Just ridiculously wrong. In ways that make no sense. And then I think, oh, this is how it feels for everyone who has,
Yeah.
I have a friend who's in medical school, and it's great to like sit down and make her watch Grey's Anatomy or something. Right? She just gets apoplectic. It's very, very entertaining.
Yeah, everyone's an expert on something. This is it.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, I had a series, a fantasy series, urban fantasy, the Marla Mason series, and there's one that's set in Hawaii, and part of it involves a boat trip between two Hawaiian islands. And I got someone very upset with me in the boat world, even though there's almost nothing in the scene. It's barely even a scene. It's mostly just referred to, and they're like, but really, you should know this is an incredibly treacherous crossing and all this stuff. And I'm like, I said, well, that's true. Keep in mind, everyone on the boat was basically a wizard, so they could handle it.
That's your just cheat code. Anytime someone says
That's
something,
right.
or they spot a typing error, wizard, wizard.
That's right. A wizard did it.
Oh, okay. Wizard. Yeah.
That's actually a secret key to unlock the truth about that fictional universe. You just have to really...
Yes. The wizard did it. Oh, okay.
Oh, that's right.
It's the secret within the secret. You have to be paying attention. Otherwise, Yes, that's what I should have probably said. I've got wizards in mind. I should have said, that was a mistake on purpose that a wizard did to alert someone.
That's right.
It's the meta story behind the real story. Yeah.
That's right. Very well spotted. You're a sophisticated reader.
So you're the one who spotted it. Well done. That sounds really interesting, though, the fact that he's such a very different... It's not a warrior or a wizard or a typical character at all. The structure, to some degree, as you said, mirrors Best Served Cold, but the actual main character, very different.
Oh yeah, something of a physical coward to some extent, right? He's not someone who's ever had to fight, and he's from a culture where they just take it as read that they are superior to all the savages, which is everyone else in the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, and he's not likable at all. Like, you feel for him because he really is cruelly done by, and there is a deeper story to why he ends up having to flee and all that. It's more than it appears on the surface, as any good trilogy should do. It should recontextualize. In the second book, you should realize that things aren't what you thought they were in the first book, right? It's very satisfying, but yeah, it's a deeply atypical approach to fantasy, which is also part of what I like about it.
Yeah, sounds really good. I might have to check that one out.
Yeah, try it.
Okay, so tell us about your third novel.
Well, this is a collection, so I hope I have.
That's allowed, yeah. If it's an official collection, not like RJ who attempted to sellotape two books together and pass them off as one. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that again.
Well, I saw once they did a complete Agatha Christie. That the spine of it was about 4 feet long. Yeah. That they had bound together into a giant stunt book. So I considered that, but seemed too much. Yeah. So my third one is Magic for Beginners by Kelly Link. Kelly is my favorite short story writer, I would say. Probably my favorite living short story writer, certainly. And Magic for Beginners, which is the novella, or maybe long novelette, title story, is my favorite story. And it's a story that I have reread many times over the years. And Kelly's work, did you know Kelly's stories?
No, I don't, actually.
Yeah, so Kelly is extremely literary. She's a genius. She writes these deeply unpredictable and surreal short stories that are still somehow incredibly satisfying, even though they tend to eschew traditional narrative structures. My own short stories are much more conventional. I could never write anything as weird as Kelly does. But Magic for Beginners is a wonderful, dreamlike, long story. It's about a kid named Jeremy Mars, whose father is a horror writer. And his friends all get together to watch this TV show called The Library. And it's a show that airs on different channels at different times and is never listed anywhere. And you just have to sort of luckily stumble upon it. And it's a TV show about a magical library where weird characters do extremely bizarre things, and gradually the strange stuff from the show begins to leak into Jeremy Mars's life, and it ends up with all these strange metaphysical and metafictional levels. And it's also just delightful, and the characters are great, and it's hilarious, and it's strange and surprising, and all of Kelly's stories are like that. And the book is full of some of her best stuff. And the reason that I would pick her book to take is because it is one that stands up to so much rereading. There are things that you read them and you get all the juice out of them the first time you read them. And that can be fine, right? But she writes the sort of things that just reward rereading because you're always finding new levels and new things. And, she's the kind of person who'll put in one story enough ideas that I would, make 10 stories out of them. And she just puts them all in one.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Just packs them all
she's
into
great.
a short story. Wow.
Yeah. She's an amazing. She's a great person too. I met her for the first time probably in the early 2000s at WisCon, and her and her husband Gavin Grant, they do Small Beer Press, and they do the zine Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, which I published in a couple times. And they're just wonderful people. You know, they're some of the nicest and kindest and most generous people that I know in the field. Yeah, this is a terrible choice. I'll take it and get sad and lonely, and miss my friends. Oh dear. Oh well. Too late now.
I'd sort of scanned some of the titles and the details of some of the short stories in this one, and some of them sound like fascinating. Like this one that's got a convenience store for zombies.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
What is that comedic, or is it scary and creepy?
It actually ends up being a very sort of sad and melancholy story.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Ultimately, yeah. Yeah. Well, she does do things that are creepy. I'm trying to remember which ones are in this particular collection. I probably should have had it here in front of me. But she can do scary things. She has one called The Specialist's Hat that is a deeply creepy ghost story, which is wonderful. Where are my L's?
So do the books, are some of the short stories commenting on things in society today, and she's just looking at them through an unusual prism, or they're just sometimes interesting stories for ideas that she's exploring?
They are often contemporary. She doesn't very often do things that are, complete secondary world.
Yeah.
Usually it's set in our world or sort of a skewed version of our world, which is also despite the first two books that I mentioned being secondary world fantasies, the thing that I like the most and the things that I write the most as a fantasy writer are contemporary fantasy stuff.
Yeah.
And so I think inevitably when you're writing about that sort of thing, you're going to be commenting a little bit on what the world around you. But her stuff is just so hard to classify.
Yeah.
It's let me think about some of the stories in it. So like The Fairy Handbag, which I think won a Nebula Award, is a great story, and it's about a magical handbag that contains vast things. But it's also about being a refugee and about diaspora, right? Mm-hmm. She has one called Stone Animals that I think was in the Best American Short Stories. The same year I had a story in the Best American Short Stories. Actually, Kelly was the person who called me about that when I got a story in the very venerable Best of Series Best American Short Stories. They called up Kelly first, and she said, "Who else is in it?" And then she said, "Let me call Tim and tell him."
Wow.
So that was a fun call.
Yeah.
But that story, Stone Animals, is about, it's really neat. It's about stuff that becomes haunted, like a toothbrush becomes haunted, right, and just becomes abhorrent to people. But it's also about sort of suburban malaise and about divorce and alienation, right?
Okay.
And she has one called Lull, which is really about storytelling. It's a series of kind of nested stories. There's stories about the devil and a cheerleader and stuff like that. And it's about sort of the nature, I think, of constructing reality with short stories. It's possible Kelly would disagree with all of my characterizations here, but this is how I read them. So she does, to me, what I think you can do really well with fantasy, which is engage with matters of the human heart through a metaphorical lens. I'm also perfectly happy to read stuff where it's not a metaphor, where it really is just a monster, but these things usually at least also work on a sort of symbolic and psychological and metaphorical level.
Yeah. I always admire people who can write short stories, because I always struggle. I've done a few, but I struggle with packing in so much to so few words in such a short space of time. And I mean, you've done both, so which do you prefer? Do you like having the space and the time to explore ideas over, a novel, or currently you're doing it over a trilogy, or do you prefer the kind of short and neat and punchy and squeezing as much as you can into a very few words?
I find writing novels very restful because the world you're returning to every day for months.
Yeah.
Whereas with a short story, usually I think about them for a long time, and then I draft them in a few days or a week, and then do whatever I need to make them good. But I tend to draft them over a pretty short period of time, and then the next one you have to create a whole new universe, unless you're returning to a world. But however, I have to say short stories are what I'm best at. I started out as a poet, so to me, short stories are vastly expansive, right?
Nice.
Like, I can have 8,000 words to write about this, and a lot of those poetry skills of having exactly the right telling detail, stuff like that, transfers well to a short story. I have grown to like novels, and I think I'm at my best. I am a good novelist. With short stories, at my best, I am a great short story writer. They're not all great, but like when everything's firing, I can produce a very good short story. He said modestly. Novels, I feel, my novels I think are perfectly good, and a lot of people like them, and people keep publishing them, thankfully. But short stories, I think, is probably the natural thing for me. And also just the most formative stuff that I read when I was young were short stories. I would my local library had the first couple volumes of the year's best fantasy and horror, the Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow year's best that went on for ages. And actually Gavin and Kelly took over the fantasy side for the last few volumes of that series. And, that was 500,000 words of stuff by writers who became my favorite writers. People like Jonathan Carroll and Tanith Lee and Charles DeLint and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So part of it was just that was what I loved when I was young, so that's what I wanted to do. I'm more of I do a Patreon I've been doing it for going on 4 years now, where I do a new short story every month. And the whole reason I started it was because novels pay so much better. That was what I was doing. I would write short stories only when I got invited to an anthology or whatever.
Right.
I just wasn't doing them. And I thought, I love writing stories, and I don't privilege it anymore. I don't prioritize it. However, if I have a thing where there are people who expect me to produce it every month, then it'll click into my business brain, right? It'll go on the calendar, it'll get scheduled. And that's been one of the best creative decisions I've made in my career, was to find a way to bring short stories, which are my first love, my great strength, back to the forefront of my life. So every month I get to write one. It's pretty great.
It's something I'd definitely like to explore more going forward, I think. But I think I'd also need that pressure of someone saying, okay, there's this anthology, you've got to contribute one that's about this theme. Go, you've got 2 months. And I think I need that, as opposed to going, oh, what can I write about? I don't know, and just floundering around.
Parameters are helpful, yeah. When you face that whole, I can do anything, can be a liberating or a terrifying thing. No, I absolutely get that. I'm doing a few little flash pieces now for one of the role-playing games, which I probably shouldn't say which one in great detail, but they're kind of neat because they're essentially little vignettes to illustrate, not to illustrate, to prosify illustrations, right? So I get given artwork, and then you write a little vignette that somehow relates to that artwork, and that's been really cool. To be prompted by an image is a pretty fun way.
Yeah, and you're writing within a specific universe that you know the rough parameters of, and you can go, okay, I can do this and create this, but I can't go too far because it'll contravene what's already set down. Yeah,
exactly. Role-playing game writing is neat because it's like writing historical fiction, except there's a person you can email and say, so, did this thing happen? Which you can't really do in history. You just have to kind of cobble it together and look for sources. But this one you can say, now, would it be plausible in this place and this time to do this thing? And then we'll say yes. Or no, or let me talk to the creative director and get back to you.
Yeah, I did that. I did some work for a computer game, and they wanted some kind of extra metafiction to go with something. So someone pulled something off the shelf, and they opened the book, and they wanted to flick through a few pages. So I had to write that, and that was interesting. And then I had to write like some comedic articles within the world of this kind of fantasy. It's sort of modern fantasy thing with zombies and werewolves things. So that was quite fun too, because I had set parameters. I knew where I was going, I knew what I was doing, and they said, write an 800-page pseudo Vogue article about fashion within this world. Okay, and off I went. So
yeah, no, that's fun. Yeah, well, that's good stuff.
Yes, I think I'd definitely like to do more short stories, but I think I'd have to have some kind of parameters.
You can arbitrarily set your own too. I used to do a game where I would ask people to give me a content aspect and a structural aspect, right. And then like one of them was write me a story that has 6 scenes and 3 artificial intelligences, right? Just write me a story about robots that's in future tense, stuff like that.
Okay.
And which is not that hard actually, because robots get programmed. You can tell them what to do, so you can do a future tense story.
Yeah.
And I ended up selling a couple of them. So there are ways to do it.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah. Something to think about, for sure. Okay, so tell us about your fourth choice.
So I would go with... so far I've had 2 depressings and an enigmatic. So for the sake of variety, for the last couple, I'm going to go a little differently. I would do To Say Nothing of the Dog by Connie Willis, which is a sequel to a profoundly depressing book called Doomsday Book, which is about time travel and the Black Plague. To Say Nothing of the Dog is about time travel and romantic comedy, so much more happy. I like Connie Willis's writing a lot. I like her romantic comedy mode a lot. I think that at her best, her wordplay is delightful and the interplay between the characters is delightful. And To Say Nothing of the Dog is just a big, silly, confusing in the sense that it's very intricate and the characters are confused. The main character is somewhat shell-shocked and kind of sent on a barely understood mission to the Victorian era, at the same time as Jerome K. Jerome's comedic classic 3 Men in a Boat, To Say Nothing of the Dog, is set, which is also a book that I love. So I would read it for fun and to restore my faith in humanity and to be with characters that it's enjoyable to spend time with, as opposed to some of those other books.
I think you need it after some of those other books. just to make you want to stay around. Yeah, something a bit more amusing.
Have to balance the humors, absolutely.
Oh yeah. Wow. So it's focused more on the characters and the fun of it rather than the sort of getting into the science fiction aspect of the time travel. Is that right?
Yeah, some of she has a whole bunch of stories, Firewatch and other stuff that's set in that same world, which is essentially, a future Oxford where the history department can actually send people back in time. And there's always lots of hijinks and misconnections. And she's done, she did Blackout and All Clear, which is about, the Blitz, and is much more depressing. And Doomsday Book is much more depressing. Some of the Firewatch stuff is pretty depressing. So this one, she took that same setting and instead did something madcap and romantic comedy. So it's a very bright spot in that series and very, very just thematically and tonally different from other stuff in that series. But, it's pleasant to read something that's not as grim sometimes.
Yeah. So are the books loosely connected then within that series, or within the same sort of time travel department from Oxford?
Yeah, and so you get some of the same faculty members will drift through and stuff like that. But the main characters in To Say Nothing of the Dog are very much, as far as I remember, they're just for that book. And it's great, you get to fall in love in the past and be confused about what's happening. And for much of it, they're trying to find this artifact, this hideous piece of Victorian interior design, the Bishop's bird stump. And so they're sort of wandering around churches and rummage sales and looking at attics and trying to find this thing that they think might have been destroyed in a bombing run, but they think might have survived somewhere. And it just has an inherent silliness to it that infuses the whole book with this very light tone. It's just really enjoyable.
It sounds really a fun and sort of charming book, and also the idea of being able to be a historian to go back and check things. That just sounds like such a good idea.
Oh yeah, no, it's and if you know something's going to be destroyed, maybe you can nick it, right?
Yeah, the day before,
you can risk it. That's right.
Well, it was destroyed. Are you sure? Well, maybe.
It vanished from the timeline anyway.
Well, yeah. People say, the cup of Christ is gone. Has it? Well, we went back and we borrowed it, and now it's in the Tower of London. There you go. You can go and see it. Pay £5 and you can see the cup of Christ. That's pretty good.
No, it's an opportunity.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to make some good money. Time travel tourism. You see, that's the way forward. Get the best museum in the world in 2019 by borrowing things from the past that no one can ever see anywhere else because they don't exist anymore.
That's right. Just consolidate it. It's for their own good, really.
Yeah, want to see a real woolly mammoth? Go and get one. Bring it forward. Put it in the museum. Yeah,
Yeah, you could make an excellent time travel zoo. Yeah,
that'd be good. There you go. That's a great idea for a story.
Yeah, I don't know if I've read that exactly.
There you go.
I'm sure someone's done it, but yeah, I don't remember.
Saber-tooth tiger and get a dinosaur to check to see if they actually had feathers or not. Is it true? Go and get one, bring it back, and then you can prove to everybody, no, in fact, they don't have feathers. They had skin or fur or whatever it might be.
Body armor.
Well, there's still all this debate because they still think some of them had feathers, and even like the T-Rex, and others are saying, no, they don't, that's ridiculous. And like, well, this would solve it.
Yeah, no, it'd be good to know. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So tell me about your last book. I'm more familiar with this one than the previous one.
So I knew I wanted to take a Discworld book, and I knew within Terry Pratchett's Discworld I wanted to take one of the Witches books because they're my favorite. Yeah. And I settled on Witches Abroad because it's about traveling, and I figure if I'm on a rocket ship, thematically, I might as well read one where they go on a riverboat and fly around on their brooms. It is one of my favorite of the Witches novels from Discworld. It's the one where Granny Weatherwax and Magritte and Nanny Og have to set off for distant, I forget what it's called, Genoa. It's the sort of, essentially it's New Orleans. Yeah. It's basically fantasy Louisiana. And they have to go deal with Granny Weatherwax's terrible fairy godmother sister, Lily. And Granny Weatherwax is such a no-nonsense, absolutely competent character. I think she would be an excellent role model if one were in dire straits, you know? And as the fun thing about that book for me is that she is absolutely herself. You know, she never lets any of these foreign parts change her at all. And she refuses to adjust anything that she does to fit local norms. There is no when in Rome, do as the Romans do for Nanny. No. For Nanny Weatherwax, Granny Weatherwax. She does what she does, and she is who she is. And I think that sort of iron self-reliance would stand me in good stead if I were stranded. Also, it's very funny and delightful, and I take it down from the shelf just to read the part on the riverboat where she plays with the gamblers who are trying to cheat her, and she doesn't cheat and she doesn't use magic. She just prevents them from cheating, and she just grinds them down, you know, and she just absolutely wears them down and is, you know, digs her finger around in her ear and hums off key and just slowly drives them mad. Like, I'll just pull it down just to read that scene because it's so delightful.
Oh, did you ever meet Terry Pratchett?
I did, yeah, a couple times when we interviewed him for Locus. Yeah. Yeah, oh, what a loss.
Yeah, I met him a couple of times as well, because he used to do quite a few UK conventions going back a few years, and he'd just be there wandering around the dealer room in his hat, and he'd just sort of go up to him and like, hello, and he's like, hello, and he'd be happy to chat away to you, and he was just such a friendly guy, and he was so funny. He was just so witty.
He really was. He was sharp, yeah. Yeah, no, I was really glad that I had the opportunity to chat with him a couple times. And, you know, as I recall, I said something that I thought was witty, and he looked at me like I was an idiot. And I thought, well, to be looked like as an idiot by Terry Pratchett is still something of a distinction, you know. And he sort of said, well, I think, you know.
That means you're wrong, but I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to be polite and English and just not say it.
I can accept that from Terry Pratchett, though. You know, the secret of his hat, right? He wore the big hat all the time because he would become invisible when he took the big hat off. He would take the hat off and then no one would notice him or bother him. That was his trick, as I understand it.
Well, he's always dressed in black at conventions, but so he suddenly wore something else and he had no hat. He'd be like, that's not Terry Pratchett.
That's right. It couldn't possibly be him.
No.
Yeah, that's great.
Who's that guy? I don't know. He's a lookalike. Yeah. No,
I got to meet quite a few interesting people up at Locus. You know, because people would come. We were up in the hills in Oakland and a little bit out of the way, but people would come through San Francisco to do book tours or whatever, and they would make the pilgrimage when our founder Charles Brown was alive, especially.
Yeah.
Although I remember one time Jim Rigney, Robert Jordan, was in town doing his book tour, and he was going to come up to the house, and he had a limousine. And I do not mean he had a town car. I mean he had a stretch limousine.
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
And the limousine could not make it up the hill because they were very twisty roads up to the house. So we had to send someone down to pick him up from his limousine.
Wow.
To bring him all the way up. Yeah. But generally people made it just fine.
Okay. Wow, that's Okay, that's how you know you arrived. You can't get the limousine up the hill.
That's right. You can't even get where you're going because you're too busy and important.
Yeah. I suspect Terry Pratchett did not turn up in a limousine.
He did not, as I recall. No, come up in a limousine. He made it just fine. We may have given him a ride. I can't remember.
I remember
what he was.
A story. I think it was Neil Gaiman talked about him and Terry going on tour somewhere together, and they were signing things, and they were enormously late for this thing because Terry sent them off on an adventure, the two of them, and they arrived. They're supposed to do an hour's interview at this radio station in America, and I think they had 15 minutes left, and so they just didn't bother putting them on because Terry's like, let's just go off here, and they went off and explored and got very lost, and Neil was just starting out at that time. He's like, oh God, and Terry's like, it'll be fine. Yeah, that's just the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, I mean, he earned it, right? I mean, he was the best-selling author for a long time before Harry Potter came along, right? Yeah.
Well, they said they don't do comedic fantasy because that's Terry's bit. Don't even try and submit it because it just won't fly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, he carved it out. It was definitely his own segment of the market. I remember publishers saying they wouldn't even look at it because it just there's no competition, which is amazing to think of.
What? And they were so good, I mean, the early ones were funny, but as the series developed, they just became so deep, and they never lost any of the humor, but they became so rich. Something like Night Watch, right, is just so profound about the human condition and is still really funny. I'm just in awe. I would never try to do it, honestly. I mean, I my stuff has jokes in it. I have banter, I have some funny stuff, but yeah, he was one of a kind.
I've got so I know that later on he did some sci-fi novels with Stephen Baxter.
The Long Earth.
Yes, I've not read them. We've got the first one on the bookshelf, so it's on my to read pile, which doesn't seem to get any smaller ever. So I really want to read that. Have you read any of them?
I read the first one. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I like multiverse books a lot.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a weird multiverse, right? It's the essential idea is that there are all of these parallel Earths near us, which are basically uninhabited. And so people can sort of colonize them, right? Like it's a way to move out and have a frontier again.
Yeah.
Right. And it's and then it gets weirder than that, obviously, but it's kind of a neat combo with Baxter's, sort of science fictional stuff and Terry's humor. It's an interesting blend. Truthfully, I think I prefer Baxter's stuff alone and Terry's stuff alone more than that. But it's interesting to see how they go together. Yeah.
But it's still got his humor then within the books.
Oh yeah, well, and it also has this thing that I love in his books where you start out with some scene, some event which is completely inexplicable, right? Just baffling, and you have no idea what's going on. And then, but because you're in the hands of a master, that all will become clear, that it will be revealed, and it will be fascinating and funny and weird. But those books do that too. They start with some scenes that are just, you have no idea what's going on, who these people are, why what's happening to them is happening, and then gradually it's revealed, which is a technique it's a daring technique. You have to. There are some writers who write with such confidence that you're in good hands.
Yes.
And they can do something audacious like that, and you go with it, right? Another writer, somebody you didn't know, or someone who wrote with more tentatively, you might say, "Oh, I don't know about this," but you just know you're in such good hands.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. He was a rare talent, an incredibly kind and generous man. So sadly missed.
And so hardworking. He wrote his. He told us, and when we interviewed him, that he would sit down and he would write every day for a certain amount of time. And if he got to the end of a book before the time was up, he would, roll that sheet out of the newspaper or out of the typewriter, and then roll in the next sheet and just start the next book.
Wow.
Like the level of just work ethic and professionalism is also awe-inspiring.
Yeah. He must have put out at least like 40 books or something over his career, something like that. Something to aspire to for us all, really, I guess.
No, I finish a book and I lay around for a month and play video games. Don't do anything.
I think the longest I've done is 2 weeks. I got bored.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I got bored. I'm like, okay, I need to start something else. And by that point, I was
good.
itching, and I was like, I really need to... I was told by my other half, go and start writing because you're annoying me now. So I did.
Yeah, my wife does complain that I get antsy, and I call it the howling void. Right, when I'm not working on a project, the howling void opens up.
Yeah.
The center of meaninglessness. At the heart of life.
Yes.
Usually, I can ignore it by writing. So
It's familiar. Yeah. I now have a name for it. Okay. So, unfortunately, as I said at the start, I'm going to have to crash land you on an alien planet of some kind. However, you do get to choose what kind of a planet you would like. And it can be a specific one if you want. So, what kind of planet do you think you'd like to live on?
Well, I gave this some thought, and a lot of the existing planets in science fiction literature, they're full of annoying people and beings and stuff, and things that try to kill you because conflict drives narrative. So I think I'll go instead with sort of a nice generic. Let's say I sort of land in an equatorial region, someplace with lots of nice archipelagos, lagoons. Lots of fish that have never encountered a predator, at least a predator that comes in from above.
Okay.
I'm confident in my ability to construct a trap for crabs, and to harvest shellfish and to do fishing. I could manage to cobble that together. My survival skills are pretty minimal, but I did at least a bit of fishing when I was younger, so I think I could not starve myself. And truthfully, I don't get to Hawaii often enough. So if I could stay in sort of a lovely blue water, nice and warm and serene, some palm trees. You can put 2 suns up there. I mean, that's fine. Some palm fronds to construct a nice hut, the kind of place where sleeping inside and outside feels exactly the same because the temperature is perfect. A harrowing kind of...
Terrible.
A death planet, really, is what I would go for. Okay. No, I'm deeply lazy, so...
You think you'd survive for long then? Sort of a castaway like the Tom Hanks film and slim down and fish all day?
Right, and I think the mistake is to do something too strenuous and risk breaking your ankle or, getting a wound that's infected. So instead, lots of lying around and reading my books on the beach and, catching the odd fish. Yeah, I think that would be good.
I think that's... I'll allow it. That's okay. Yeah. That's, a nice relaxing world, something chilled out. The only downside is you're by yourself, but as you said, sometimes that's not a bad thing.
It's not. Yeah, I'm essentially an introvert anyway. Actually, no, I did a little to finish a novel. I did this little retreat. A friend of mine has a house up in Marin, which is a beautiful country part of Northern California, and said I was welcome to go stay in their place for a week and try and really get some pages done. And I thought this is going to be fantastic. And I got up there and went insane with loneliness. Partly because the internet was extremely bad. If the internet had been better, I think I would have been okay. But because I can only work, even flat out, I can only really write or edit for 5-6 hours before my brain stops working. Yeah. And then I had all those other hours of consciousness,
What do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do?
There's only so much walking in the woods and sitting in the hot tub you can do by yourself. Plus, I thought... if I were in the hot tub and lost consciousness, I would die. No one would find me. No one would even look for me for days.
Oh, dear. Just come back to this next person who visits, finds this boiled thing.
That's right.
Shriveled up like a prune in the...
Thought it was funny. We hadn't heard from him in a couple days. Yeah.
There's what's left of him. All right. Okay. Well, no hot tub unless you make one yourself on this alien.
That's right.
So
yeah.
Maybe that's a project you could take on. Nothing too strenuous there.
Find a volcanic vent. Yeah, that could work.
Pump system and clay, and gradually build it. That's doable.
Yeah. You have to pass the time somehow.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, so enough of that nonsense. But thank you for coming on and telling us about your books that you take on Crash Landing.
Yeah, this is delightful. It's nice to talk to you again.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. My thanks to Tim Pratt for joining me this episode. If you'd like more information about his books, on his website, timpratt.org. There's also information on his current SF trilogy from Angry Robot at their website, which is angryrobotbooks.com. And don't forget to look for the third novel in his SF trilogy, which is coming out later this year. You can also follow him on Twitter under @TimPratt, and don't forget to check out his Patreon site for more information about his short stories that he releases every month. Thanks for listening, and if you'd like to support this podcast and all of the others, please leave us an iTunes review, and don't forget to check out the other podcasts on the Geek Syndicate network, which you can find on iTunes or at geeksyndicate.co.uk.